This is a response video of sorts. It's a response to a video called Badiou's Clash with D and G, as in Deleuze and Guattari. It's a recent video by a YouTuber called Deleuze Philosophy. His channel is named. I just watched it and I decided to make a response video, my first ever, across the multiple YouTube channels I actually have on like science fiction movies and tons of stuff. But this time I felt like this, it's worth it. It felt really important, not because I had anything against Deleuze Philosophy's video. Quite the opposite. I thought it was really excellent, informative. I know a little about Deleuze, but not much. I've just read, bits here and there, and I know even less about Badiou, really. But that video, which was about a long-standing quarrel, if you like, that Badiou had with Deleuze ever since the 60s, there was something in there, okay? There was something that really jumped out at me as a massive issue. And it's an issue I see quite often in philosophical discussions and just political discussions in general. And even though Deleuze philosophy briefly touched on it in a subtle way, I thought it warranted what you're about to see here today. So, what's the core issue that I will be expounding upon, okay? It's Badiou's over-reliance on cheap tricks. Like cheap rhetorical tricks, cheap, sophistic tricks. Anyway, like a series of philosophical semi-Jedi mind tricks that are beneath, in my opinion, what one would expect from certainly from a lifelong philosopher. Anyway, this is not, I will be mainly critiquing Badiou tricks I think he uses, but again, the idea here is that these deceitful practices, dare I say, are omnipresent in public discourse. We're drowning in them day in, day out on our lives. And they are a huge plague on our collective existence as a species. They're a huge mental trap we all fall into. And truth be told, a huge reason why I started this channel in my heart was because of this. Right? So this is why I'm making the reaction video. Again, the Deleuze Philosophy video is really excellent, but there was something in there that I felt really needed to be developed. Okay, so this is this development. Okay, so these tricks, these mental tricks, are a big part of why we get intellectually bamboozled so easily, often by people who claim to be doing precisely the opposite. I'm thinking here of a lot of so-called analytic philosophy. I'm sorry for those who ascribe to that school, if you can call it that, which Badiou in fact relies upon quite heavily. Now, this is not mainly a video about analytic philosophy. I've read not that much about it, not very much of the actual texts, though from what I understand of that tradition, if you can call it that, it's even wrong to ask them what are their important texts. Like that's not even how they think and work. But again, that's a topic for another day. What I did read in analytic philosophy in general is a lot of the same issues I saw in the Badiou text that Deleuze Philosophy was quoting, and also the very short work I read today. So I'm not saying that all analytic philosophy in total is worthless. In fact, I am very convinced. I'll almost say I know for a fact that some of it, at least, is worthwhile, that some good work was done using that method in that tradition. Every tradition, no matter how ludicrous, always produces good stuff. I mean, because human beings are ingenious. So yeah, anyway, but yeah, I'm not saying all analytic philosophy or, you know, what Badiou does today. I'm not saying it's all worthless, but what I'm saying is that based on what I've seen, it does a lot of unworthy things. And unworthy of what? Well, unworthy of the high principles it purportedly ascribes to. Mm-hmm. So, who am I to criticize such haughty thinkers? Well, these are lifelong philosophers. You Badiou, he's been a philosopher longer than I've been alive. So I'm not a lifelong philosopher. I'm a self-taught philosopher. I've been learning philosophy, all my life. I mean, I started reading, philosophical texts in my 20s, but I didn't understand most of it. I've been mostly really putting in the work since last year, so I'm learning philosophy. Same as we all are, I guess. And as you might know, based on my other videos, I decided to bite the bullet, read the damn texts. I built a massive list of what I considered the essential texts of the philosophical corpus, the Western, mostly, philosophical corpus. Built a 4-year, 5-year reading plan, and I'm about a quarter of the way through. So I've read all of Aristotle, all of Plato, a third of Plotinus so far. I started reading Al-Farabi recently. I read some Heidegger and other stuff, but that's a general idea of where I'm coming from. So, and a lot of it I've only read once, so a superficial reading. I forget what the name is in the Adler book, How to Read a Book, but mostly that level. Okay, I've thought about it obviously a lot, but mainly I've been considering philosophy as a second language, so I'm learning it by absorbing a lot of stuff, and I have found, though I did have my doubts, that some of it stuck. And it did have an effect on me, and I did find that it was a lot easier to understand a lot of those inscrutable texts. At least they appeared inscrutable when I started, a lot less now. You might say, how dare you, just a guy, criticize these professional philosophers? Yeah, I'm just a guy. That is precisely my point. That is precisely my point. I'm just a guy. Started last year, really getting into it. So what you will get today is the observations of a, self-learning philosopher after 1 year of intensive work, but still 1 year of work. And if you do the same, you will most likely get quite comparable results. It does work. There's an accumulation effect, and I like it. At least I think it's worthwhile. You be the judge, okay? Okay, so what is another way of articulating my main thesis about Badiou's work based on what I've seen? So my main thesis is that Badiou is not always in bad faith, like writing or speaking in bad faith, certainly writing. Badiou is not always in bad faith, but he frequently relies on bad faith and other cheap tactics which undermine his work. Okay? He's not always in bad faith, but he uses cheap tricks which undermine his work. They do not make it worthless. Okay, this is a point I will probably be making a few times in this video. Okay, these cheap tactics do not make his entire work worthless. They undermine it. Okay, not the same thing. They, at the very least, make them less credible. Okay, to me. Okay, it's not how I would do it. Okay, and yeah. So what is my plan? It's a three-part plan, as we usually do in these things. I will explain very briefly my methodology for what I'm doing today. So that's part one. Second, I will do a very quick recap of Badiou's ideas, such as I understand them at this stage. And three, I will point out the three main faults I have identified in Mr. Badiou's work. That is to say, one, it's full of empty rhetoric and sophistic. Two, it's apostolic. And three, it's poor logic. Okay, so there's a core logical error, and it's quite common, actually. So the three faults in Badiou's work, it's a rhetoric sophistic, it's apostolic, and it's poor logic. Okay, so I feel like Johnny Cochrane. Again, this does not invalidate Badiou's entire work. Not at all. Nor does it diminish the value of some of his observations. But it does shed some light on his, methodology and the way he structures his arguments and builds them and makes them, those arguments he's trying to make, not as convincing, I think, as he would like. Okay, it undermines his purpose. Okay, number one, my methodology for this video. So this actually is just a quick reaction video. Okay, so I don't know how long it's going to last, but it's quick because I did not spend days and days writing down quotes and page numbers and all these things, which in a serious piece of work one should do. Okay? So I did not do it for time reasons, for just that sort of like logistic reasons. The stuff I have to do this week, and I wanted to make this video today. Like I might do a Substack article on this topic, and if I do, I will include more precise references, just actual quotes to better illustrate the points I'll be making here today. But in a way, it's not a problem for our purpose today in this video, because a quick reaction is the point, in fact, as I was just mentioning quickly. So you have an example of just a guy who read 1 year of Plato and Aristotle, like the whole enchilada, the whole corpus, and again some other stuff. But okay, what does that give you in terms of general reflexes, and how does that affect your way of seeing things, of thinking, analyzing things? So that's generally the idea. Obviously, a part of it is my own personality. Like I do have a certain way of analyzing things. There are some things that are unique to me, but a lot of them are depend on personality type. But generally speaking, you have an example of a Homo sapiens who did the work, and after 1 year, here's generally how one reacts after acquiring the reflexes one naturally integrates as we read these wonderful works. Okay, yeah, what sort of tools does reading through Plato, Aristotle, etc. over a year give you? How useful are they? Are they useful? You be the judge. Also, in terms of methodology, what am I basing myself on here? What will I be using as material? Well, first, I'm basing myself on a first read-through of Aristotle's Organon, so his treatise on logic. This is like the French edition, which is the main edition I've read the Gilles translation. This is like really, 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 really wonderful translation. Yeah, I read it only once, but there are a few books, in the topics, for instance. Like there's a few passages I did read quite a few times, and I'm still absorbing. These are lifelong books, like you read them your whole life through. So I'm basing myself a lot on that. I'm also basing myself on the rhetorical texts of the Corpus Aristotelicum. So there are, I think, like somewhere between 2 or 4, I don't remember, but there's obviously Aristotle wrote a very famous rhetoric, but there's also a lesser known work called the Rhetoric to Alexander, which actually Aristotle didn't write, but when the catalogue was established of Aristotle's work in the 1600s or something like that, it was included then as a, at least possibly by Aristotle document. We know it's not by Aristotle, the Corpus Aristotelicum, because it teaches how to argue in bad faith. Rhetoric to Alexander is supposed to be a document that Aristotle, who was Alexander the Great's teacher, right, in real life. So, and it presents itself as a document that Aristotle wrote for Alexander, you know. But I think in the Oxford edition there are some excellent notes that explains why it's patently untrue. I mean, it doesn't make sense historically for many reasons, and it's very well explained. But the key hint, the most obvious one, is that Aristotle would never teach you to argue in bad faith without telling you that it's horrible. He's not about that at all. Okay, he does not believe in bad faith. Okay, he's against it. But for our purposes today, even though I won't be quoting from it directly, I mean, it's a very useful book to point to. I mean, I do invite you to read it, because again, you'll recognize tricks that plenty of people, like politicians, journalists, priests, bloggers, YouTubers, like just tricks that people use all the time, like again, cheap tricks, and which Badiou uses. Okay, so that informed this video. Also, other source, well, obviously the Deleuze Philosophy video. I watched it twice. I took some notes. A big part of it is about the fight, like the philosophical details of the fight between Deleuze and Badiou, like what were they arguing about. And I won't go into the details here because he understands it much better than I do. I haven't, dived into this subject, and it's not a topic here today. The topic is that the nature of the arguments themselves that Badiou resorts to, the tricks, again, are deceitful or dishonest or something in that general category. Okay, they pass for philosophy, but they are clearly not. Okay, so in a sense, sophistry. Okay, so yeah, I'm basing myself on that. I only read one work by Badiou, and that was today, and that was the introduction to Being an Event, which I found on Amazon, actually, when you preview the book, so I could read the whole thing there. And I liked it, I enjoyed it, but I did see some of the faults in it that I'm going to describe today. I read it in French, as I mentioned. I think this is important for reasons I think I expound upon later, but this matters actually, because when you read translations, especially English translations, I have usually found that there is a distortion that happens, and any translation causes such distortions. I mean, you learn to live with it. But anyway, I read it in French. I also will reference, at least implicitly, also reference Zizek's Tarrying with the Negative, a book, Kant, Hegel, and the Critique of Ideology. I read this last year. It was the first Zizek book I read. One of the first real hardcore philosophy books I read the whole way through. And again, I enjoyed it very much, but it also has comparable issues. So yeah, one of two Zizek books I think I've read in its entirety. I also read some articles, obviously watched a few of his videos, and I enjoy his work. I think he's quite... I like Zizek. I think he's an important philosopher. Certainly culturally, he's probably the most famous living philosopher right now. He's the number one philosopher many of us think about. But yeah, he has the same sort of issues. So I'll be mentioning a couple. Okay, so that's for methodology. Okay, recap of Badiou's general ideas. Okay, based on on the video by Deleuze Philosophy and the notes I took by when reading the introduction to being an event, I think. Yeah, being an event. Okay, I'm doing a good faith effort at being the most honest as I can be in describing what I understand his main theses to be. Okay. Badiou, first of all, comes from a Maoist and Lacanian perspective. So the Maoist, I'm not... I read a lot of Marx, actually, and I do know, comparatively a lot, actually, about certainly the radical politics of the 60s, like all over the world, actually. I'm Québécois, I'm in Quebec. There was a lot of that here, actually, and I knew some of the actual people involved back in the day, so I also did my master's on semi-adjacent topics. But Maoist, I never exactly knew what was their big thing. However, he was still back in the day very orthodox. The party comes first, communist. He was a militant communist. Of the party is always right. It's the workers' party, and that sort of guy. He has, as I said, a Lacanian perspective. So if you've read Zizek or heard him talk, but mostly in his writings, actually, you'll see very clear comparisons. Okay, mostly, in great part because of the whole idea that there is no self. Sort of hyper-nihilistic, materialistic on Buddhism. So you don't exist. Okay, you're an illusion. There is no individual. There is no subject. It's all a lie. And if you believe it, you're a monster. Like you're a horrible, degenerate human being if you believe that you exist. And that very strong condemnation, it's often palpable. The basic foundation of how he explains this, that, we don't exist, and this, there is no subjectivity, there's none of that, or barely at all, and the small tidbits we have are just an illusion. So that whole Lacanian thing. What does Maoism look like? We'll have a little bit of a hint later on as I quote some of his work in the actual What is the Problem with Badiou part of the video. He states, Badiou does, that metaphysics is concerned with the underlying unity of things. That is to say that metaphysics is concerned with the one. So this is the definition that he gives. And he seems to believe that everybody who has ever, delved in metaphysics has shared this definition. It may be valid, it may not be. This does not matter today. What matters is that this is his position, as I understand it. I think I'm being fair. He pretty much states it explicitly. And Badiou does not believe that such a one exists. He believes it does not. And I believe that Deleuze also shares this understanding. And if I remember Deleuze Philosophy's video correctly, yeah, they had a disagreement, Badiou and Deleuze, on something to do about the way they understood that topic. Like, they shared the same basic idea, but they had, you might say, an argument about doctrine, you know, like between, like you might have in the Middle Ages between two, you know, Catholic scholars or something like that. Some sort of like, they share the same faith, but but they still have radically different worldviews, which brings them at odds. Okay. And as I mentioned earlier, Badiou believes that people who do believe in the one, okay, so the underlying unity of all things, so he believes that, to coin a word, which he does not use, I will be clear on that, but he believes that they are, in a word, evil. Okay. And it might come across as a bit exaggerated to say that this is what he believes. And I am sure he would get very cross at me if he heard me say that he thinks people who believe in the one are evil. Okay, anyone at all. But yeah, he does not use that term because it doesn't belong to the jargon, the accepted jargon of his worldview. Okay, so his worldview is materialistic, and in the narrative of materialism, on planet Earth, like for the last 500 years or so, materialism is opposed to the whole semantic field of religion and metaphysics and all that stuff. Okay, and to use a word like evil is something that the religious people use. Okay, the metaphysician people use, mostly the religious people. Okay, so yeah, the mystics might use words like evil, but we who are rational materialists, we would never use words like evil because we don't believe in such metaphysical absurdities, right? So they won't use it. Okay, but he does treat the belief in the one. I will ask you to trust me on this. I mean, go read the pieces I mentioned. But he does treat people who believe in the one as saying something that is so bad. Okay, so to say that the one might exist is so bad that to even think that it is a possibility that the one exists, to say something that might even remotely be compatible with an interpretation of what you're writing that might imply that the one exists. Okay, anything that is not a radical and public repudiation of the concept of the one. An explicit, I have a t-shirt saying the one, it doesn't exist. Like, if anything more subtle than that is such a taint that it invalidates your entire work. And we know this because of the polemics that he engages in, because he uses terms like metaphysics and the general idea of the one, because he equates the two. Metaphysics equals belief in the one. Okay, so, and he uses things like metaphysical as words of condemnation, of, again, radical condemnation, head on the chopping block, metaphorically, condemnation. Okay, so yeah, it's not evil because you don't believe in God, but it's this, like, same difference. Okay, I think this interpretation I'm telling you is fair and supported by the text. If you don't agree, leave a note in the comments. Anyway, I think, this is generally his worldview. Okay. And if you want more examples, do check out the Deleuze Philosophy video. Okay, and finally, I think I mentioned this, Badiou believes there is no subject with a capital S, so individuals don't really exist. I'm sure he doesn't believe that cultures exist either. Nothing exists except the party, I guess, and, whatever. If you've read, again, some Zizek, if you've seen some of his interviews or videos or presentations, he does expound on this very exact idea, the whole petit objet, petit a, and the jouissance that can never be partaken into of the thing that you... Yeah, it's not like you believe that you're that you exist because you project outside of yourself a false thing which you desire, but which is completely abstract and arbitrary, and this gives you your false sense of self. I think it's the general idea, which incidentally is quite a defendable presentation of part of the psyche. I will say this today, again, topic for another day, but all of these things, all of these conflicts, okay, most of the point of views that are being presented, they are quite true if from this perspective or on that layer of human perception / existence, so yeah, the objet petit a thing, the Lacan construction, like model of the psyche, it's quite valid, I think, for a part of the psyche. There are some thinkers like Zizek and apparently Mr. Badiou who believes that because this whole thing, this mechanism that Lacan describes, because they believe in it, this means that there is no such thing as a person, actually, and you're evil if you think there is. As you can tell, I don't believe in most of that. I'm not a Maoist. I don't believe that political parties of any sort are likely to do anything more constructive than destructive. I'm quite skeptical of much of Lacan. I believe he's mostly... I question his intellectual honesty, but I think his model still works. And anyway, the idea here again is not that I believe it or not, or don't. Maybe they are right and maybe I am wrong. But the problem is not in the content, as I said, it's about the method. Okay? How are the arguments explained? And how are they presented and defended, and why is it why is it cheap tricks? Why is it intellectually dishonest? Why do I use words like unworthy? Okay, so at last we come to the heart, the meat and the potatoes of our little intellectual endeavor. I will drink a small sip of this delicious homemade lemonade. Yeah, pretty good. Okay. Problems in Badiou's method. 1. Empty rhetoric. Rhetoric isn't bad. I just used some a couple of minutes ago with my rhyming trick. The Johnny Cochran bit. There are 3 problems with Badiou's work. It's rhetoric, it's apostolic, and cheap logic. So yeah, it's rhyme. I'm rhyming, and even again, cheap logic. I shouldn't put in the same category. The actual logic of my rhyme doesn't work. Topic for another day. But it's a rhetorical trick. Okay, it's rhyming. Why did I do that? Because it's catchy and because it's a way of putting my point across, which is more efficacious than the the non-stop rambling I do sometimes engage in. Okay, so yeah, rhetoric isn't bad. It organizes your thoughts, it makes them more easily understood, it makes them less boring. So rhetoric, it's fine. Okay, But rhetoric, as Aristotle pointed out, it can be used in deceitful ways. Plato also said this. Okay, so this was bemoaned by Plato and Aristotle. And why? Because you can, if you know the tricks and the person you're talking to doesn't, well, you can bamboozle the person. You can, you can do the Jedi mind trick thing. So first quotation. This is stuff I'm quoting from Deleuze Philosophy's video. So all these quotes, they come directly from his video. He did the research on this. I'm just quoting. But this is like the first thing that really jumped out at me. I will quote the whole thing, okay? This is Badiou writing, I think in the 60s, and he did refine his writing as I observe today, because in his introduction to Being an Event, I think it's a book from the 90s, 96 or something like that. It's more subtle than this, but here, okay, he's writing in the 60s, and he says. He's attacking Deleuze for not being a good communist, I guess. Okay, a bad philosopher because he's not a good communist. Okay, what do they oppose here as well to the toil of prevision and of revolt, immersed at the deepest in the workers' divisions, which constitutes the unparalleled affirmative power of Maoist militants? Okay, so you can see the tone right away. And if you've read works by especially communist militants, like but even other ideological or religious orientations, you recognize the general bombastic tone. Okay, and he goes on, what can they, like Deleuze, Guattari, what can they capitalize on against these thoughts, real in themselves, ever recast and traversed through and through by proletarian interpellations? Okay, is there anything of value equal to the project of letting the idea of the party be torn from one's hands by the masses, that which in France is not yet established, not yet decided upon, but still to be proposed and remade? What kind of quote-unquote desire will ever equal the one deployed throughout the profound entanglements and countercurrents of our history, the one Marxist-Leninists formulate to hand back to the working class the question of its communist party of the new type? What is the final word of these hateful adversaries of all organized revolutionary politics? Read, to complete this process that is always and already complete as it proceeds, in effect, to seep out like pus. In the end, such maxims are innocent. Look at them, these old Kantians who pretend they're playing at scattering the trinkets of culture. Look at them, the time is nigh, and they're already covered in dust. Well, that's purple prose. I mean, it has not aged well. I mean, can one find enjoyment in the aesthetics of it? It's totally possible, but it is an aesthetic piece of writing. So that's my first point. This is entirely through and through a work of rhetoric. Okay, what are the philosophical points being put forth here? There are zero. He's saying he's using elaborate sentences and poetic structures and metaphors, seep out like pus, to illustrate emotionally the point he's trying to make. Yeah. So human beings, we have thoughts and we have emotions. So thoughts is reason, and emotions is like, not reason. And I actually think we undervalue like the irrational. I think it's quite legitimate. There are many things we can only understand, for instance, with works of art. But interestingly, Mr. Badiou does not believe that at all. In the Being and Event introduction, he explicitly says that Heidegger is wrong on ascribing a value to poetry. And he says, no, the only real truth is mathematics. Like, the only real ontology is mathematics. I forgot to mention that. Because, yeah, nothing exists, so only the pure thought of mathematics is ontologically real. Okay, because there is no one, so something. Anyway, but yeah, I'm not the one who doesn't believe in poetry. Like Mr. Badiou is. And if you're using figures like Deleuze's phrase, it's just like to seep, like it seeps out like pus, not exact quote, but what do they oppose here as well to the toil of prevision and of revolt? That whole thing, that is straight out of Cicero. Yeah, this is old school. Rhetoric. Like, this is what lawyers talk like when they are presenting their closing arguments. When they have finished presenting their evidence and they're trying to rile up, the jurors. Yeah, so they recap their points, but they're trying to get you emotionally, right? To really drive home the point, okay? And, what can they capitalize on against these thoughts? Is there anything of value equal to the project of letting the idea of the party be torn from one's hand by the masses? Lots of verbiage. What kind of desire will ever equal the one deployed throughout the profound entanglements and countercurrents of our history, the one Marxist-Leninist formulate to hand back to the working class the question of its communist party of the new type? Now, you might believe in all that, and it might even be true. I don't believe a word of it, but like, even if you think all this is true, and it might be, he's not giving any intellectual justification here to anything. He's just presenting a rhythmically constructed series of images building on top of each other to evoke a feeling, to give us this grandiose, emotional picture, to make us revolt against the evil fascist Deleuze, who does not believe in, the beauty of the one workers' party, of the Marxist-Leninists, who are obviously right about everything. Okay, so the core thing is there is no explanation. It's all rhetorical tricks, figures of speech. So that's the first thing I noticed. And what's the point here? If somebody speaks to you like that, well, if you enjoy the speech, that's cool, But if somebody is speaking to you like that, he's making a narration. He's talking like a priest on the pulpit. He is not presenting a rational philosophical point of view. Again, there is no reasoning here. There is no logic here. We will give examples of logic, actual logic, a bit later on. So we'll see it's completely different. Like, this is not rational. This is rhetorical. This is the sort of stuff we have in the Communist Manifesto. Okay, last bit on this. So some people will say, well, it must be a philosophical work because he's talking about philosophical stuff. If you count Marxist-Leninists as if you count that as philosophy, which is it can be. There are certainly some texts by Marx and even Lenin, I think, which we can call as philosophy, good or bad. That's another topic, but it is philosophy. But yeah, I mentioned Cicero. Well, Cicero is a well-known, philosopher, a well-known Stoic philosopher. And Cicero's writing is filled with purple prose, with rhetorical flourishes. But that does not mean that because Cicero is a philosopher and Cicero's writings in general are filled with rhetorical flourishes, anything that has rhetorical flourishes is philosophical. Even if it talks about philosophical issues, if it mentions them, they're not concepts. They're just the splashes of color you're throwing on the wall. If it's all rhetorical flashes, it's not philosophy. It takes more than that. It takes reasoning, and there's no reasoning in this text. It's all rhetoric. Same with the Communist Manifesto. Capital is a philosophical work, which it is. Okay, so Marx is a philosopher. Marx was the author of Capital. Marx is also the co-author of the Communist Manifesto. So the Communist Manifesto is a political tract written by philosophers. Therefore, the Communist Manifesto is a philosophical work, but it isn't. Okay, this is the error Jordan Peterson made. Okay, in his debate with Zizek. Capital is a philosophical work written by Marx, a philosopher. Marx writes a grocery list. Therefore, Marx's grocery list is a philosophical work. Well, no. Okay, his grocery list might have a historical importance. It might have other forms of importance, but that doesn't make it a philosophical text. To be philosophical, it needs to be other than a political tract. Okay, they don't have the same purpose, don't use the same methods. So it's a rhetorical play, not a philosophical one. Next, cheap tricks, and again, this is stuff we see all the time. I've read some. I didn't know much about analytic philosophy until last year, and the more I read about it, the more I couldn't believe. I could not believe what I was reading. That the arguments were being entertained seriously by the people who were expounding them. And why? Because it's this level of stuff, essentially, right? Anyway, calling Deleuze names. Okay, so I will again, for the lulz, I will read you a few of them. This is another screenshot I got from the excellent Deleuze Philosophy video. Badiou was in a polemic with Deleuze, but it was a one-sided polemic because Deleuze mostly didn't answer, and it is relevant to mention that at the beginning of their relationship, he was a teacher, Deleuze, and Badiou was a student, and he was a Maoist student with his group, and they would walk in the classes of Deleuze, and they would start screaming and shouting, and they were trying to force everyone who wasn't a Maoist to shut up forever, and they were trying to force the entire school to become Maoist. So there's echoes of stuff we see today. And what Deleuze did back then, I learned this from the Deleuze philosophy video, he wouldn't argue because he realized it was pointless. So, okay, go ahead. And he would just put on his hat to signify and just to signify the class was over, and he would just let the guy ramble on, right? The guy being Badiou. But Badiou was not content with this one-sided monologue of his. So he wrote a piece under a false name. He presented himself as somebody else, used a pseudonym, created a false identity, and he wrote a piece called The Fascism of the Potato. You can't make this stuff up. And in which he accuses Deleuze and, I guess, Guattari of being, I'm quoting here the list from Deleuze Philosophy's video, Mr. Badiou calls Deleuze Guattari revisionists, fascist despots, ideological leaders of the petite bourgeoisie, anti-Marxist leaders, con men, pre-fascist ideologues. So one might notice here that they are at once fascist despots and pre-fascist ideologues. So both the thinker and the doer, and both in actuality and in potential. So quite impressive when you say, pre-fascist ideologues, cunning monkeys of multiplicity is quite a nice turn of phrase here. And of course, he likens the rhizome, which is one of Deleuze's, I think both Deleuze-Guattari, certainly Deleuze's big concepts, which I know very little about, but he likens the rhizome to a potato. and hence the fascism of the potato. Well, he called Deleuze names, and some of them are pretty funny, actually. He did find a few good ones there. I will grant him that. But calling somebody names is not a philosophical argument. And actually this, there is, I mentioned the various Aristotle rhetoric works and the logic also. And this is actually, mentioned, pretty sure. Do go check, but I'm pretty convinced that he actually talks about this. Because what he's doing, when you're calling somebody names, you're either trying to do one of two things, basically. And this is like an old trick, you see. You're either trying to rile up the person you're speaking to, because having angered that person, because calling somebody names, usually that does tend to anger people because of our nervous system. It just does that, So if you call somebody names, you are likely to anger the person, and an angry person tends to look foolish. Okay, just does, once again. If you can keep your composure and make the other person lose his or her composure, you have usually won the debate. I mean, that's like a tactic. Okay, that's an old trick, because you look calm, the other looks insane. You're the voice of reason, okay? And you can put forth a lot of bad faith tactics to provoke this effect. So that's one reason why you insult people. And the other is that it amuses the gallery. And if you have no good philosophical arguments, and you can't convince them with the depth of your thought, you can certainly, in many instances, convince them that you are superior, in the monkey tribe. You prove your superiority by establishing your dominance by making fun of the other guy. So this is pretty low as a tactic, but it works. It's very effective, like on talk shows, on television. If you can, so if you make the audience laugh and you make a mean joke towards your adversary, and you make the audience laugh, well, you've probably won them over, even if you're being dishonest and the person you're insulting is actually in the right, which he quite likely is, since if you had good arguments to present against him, you wouldn't just be insulting him, you see. It's a cheap trick. This is what philosophers call a dick move. Also, he's writing under a false name, Mr. Badiou. So Aristotle doesn't mention that, passing yourself off as somebody else. But it does feel kind of deceitful, wouldn't you say? However, I don't know how old Mr. Badiou was when he did that, but I'm all about the forgiveness. And, people do stupid things a lot. We all do them. It's fine, okay? But what is certain is that maybe he wouldn't do that today. I'd like to believe he wouldn't. But it was still dishonest. Like, come on, okay? Anyway, so for further reference, see also, sophistry, in particular the last book of the Organon, like on sophistic refutations, definitely worth checking out. Also the Topics, so the one right before that. Also, I haven't read it, but if you want to know the tricks of the heuristics, so saying incredibly, outrageous things to anger your opponent in the worst bad faith possible to win the argument, and any argument, which is, that's sophistry. That's a form of sophistry. Well, Schopenhauer wrote The Art of Being Right, and that's what's it's about. Like, that's what the book is about. He explains the tactics, and that's called heuristic. So the heuristics. So yeah, the mechanics of bad faith, how to win an argument using sleazy, tactics, that sort of thing. Okay, it's quite significant that Deleuze, as I said, put his hat on and generally refused to engage publicly with Badiou when he interrupted his class. This is actually quite wise and quite beautiful. I admire that, because you can't argue with bad faith. There's no way, because bad faith is a refusal of engaging with the other. Actually, it's an aggressive manipulation. And which incidentally is also why, I mean, a lot of, like, my whole project is based on developing good faith, but it's based on developing good faith as a self-checking mechanism. Okay, I am saying that Badiou was in bad faith here, but the last thing I want is for people to start going around and accusing each other of bad faith, because that will invariably devolve into shouting matches, and we'll have the same situation we have now on Earth, which doesn't work. Okay, so you want to cultivate good faith for you, because you don't want to be the person doing that. Okay, that's why. Same thing, incidentally, with Zizek calling people stupid idiots. He does that a lot, like when he doesn't agree with somebody. Like if you say you are more a Jungian than a Lacanian, for instance, which is my case. Like my personal experience of many years is that the Jungian point of view about the nature of the psyche is in the general outlines true. Okay, but that is a big topic. I mean, I can certainly understand why people who haven't gone through that sort of work might not believe in it. It's quite normal and rational, actually, not to believe in it if you haven't had that sort of, let's call it, if you haven't done that sort of work. Okay, it's quite something. But I don't go around calling Zizek a stupid idiot because he believes in Lacan, right? I'm trying to present my own, the best arguments I can come up with why I think, it's not quite convincing. If I'm engaging in a reasonable, discourse, I'm trying to use reasonable arguments. Right, generally speaking. So yeah, anyway, calling people stupid idiots, I don't think he does that to piss people off. I think he's just impatient with people he thinks are stupid, and God knows I understand that. So I absolve thee, Mr. Zizek, but still, calling people stupid idiots, it's not an argument. You're not being a philosopher when you're doing that. Not in my book. For more info, as I said, read Aristotle, the Argonon, the Topics, the Sophistic Refutations, the Rhetoric, the Apocryphal Rhetoric to Alexander, and so forth. Okay, next, so I mentioned there are 3 faults in the Badiou playbook, 3 cheap tricks. The second is the apostolic. And what do I mean by that? I started out writing messianic, but I realized that was wrong, because he doesn't believe he's the Messiah, Badiou. And this does exist. I mean, in Quebec, there was a guy called Charles Gagnon. He was like that, or, I mean, I won't name names, but I have other examples of some well-known figures in art, or like André Breton was kind of like that. People who want to be the Pope, as we generally say. They want to be on top of the mountain and people follow them, okay? But what's interesting is that Badiou is not at all like that. Okay, and we'll give him that. But what he is a devout apostle of who he considers to be a Messiah. And these are, first of all, Lacan, who I mentioned, and he actually uses the word master because he is a Lacanian. And anybody, note to all you people, my friends, if you consider yourself whatever name, okay, with Ian at the end, like Heideggerian, Hegelian, do reconsider your life choices. Okay. I'm a big fan of Heidegger's work, but I would never call myself a Heideggerian. You know, it's just the mindset is completely different. You're not being this, like, don't be a disciple of some guy, no matter how brilliant. Be your own disciple, right? This is what the work is about. But he says, and this is super frequent, like, not only calling so-and-so master or the great Lenin and his expounding with like his wisdom. Sometimes Althusser would say stuff like that. And I like Althusser's writing, you know, a lot. I think he's a very interesting thinker, but there is this tendency, for instance, in militant Marxist thinkers to say things like that. Oh, now we know, thanks to brilliant scientific genius of this, you know, otherworldly brilliance of, you know, Marx, and who established absolute truth. We now know with certainty that, yeah. So they just follow, you know, the word of God, the materialist God. But they will say, yeah, they will say that, which is, I mean, dumb as rocks, if I may. Am I using a non-philosophical argument? I mean, it's not being philosophical. My master says this, therefore it's true, okay? And we know now, thanks to X, this comes up a lot, okay? So he does this, Badiou, quite frequently in the preface to Being and the Event. Okay, we now know with total certainty that Kant was wrong, because such and such professor from Cambridge in such and such book, which nobody has read, okay, he proved this doing, you know, perhaps doing some strange logical Bertrand Russell type of thing. This proves that Kant is an idiot and none of it is true. This is super frequent, okay? And no, it doesn't. No one has solved, you know, like the question of being, or these are not solved by a trick of Lacanian wizardry or some subtle, you know, manipulations of logical, you know, conundrums. Okay, Jean-Paul Sartre does. I think he does that a lot also. His famous book L'être et le néant, I think he kind of starts like that. We now know with certainty that the self doesn't exist. He kind of starts with that. Well, certainly it's a valid tool, writing tool. Okay, it's a tactic, it's a strategy. It has its place. Okay, you're putting forth your argument, but you're also using you're also presenting as a solved issue something that is not solved at all, and you're essentially saying, if you want to engage with me, you will accept as a certainty something which is not a certainty at all. And from now on, we will never speak of it again, certainly if you want to speak with me. Okay? Essentially, all that is an appeal to authority. Like this obscure analytic philosophy article proves once and for all that Kant is worthless. Okay. Well, did you just present the demonstration? Did you redo the demonstration and explain it to me point by point? Okay. And have you demonstrated that everything in that demonstration is true and valid, and that the premise is true? Okay. Did you define all the terms? Okay. No. Okay. Short version. Again, this is not about analytic philosophy. This is about Badiou, but the same sort of faults. Like apparently, the analytic people, they scoff at you if you mention that you might want to define your terms. Apparently, they consider that, like, they will just insult you if you say that, you know, you should do that. Yeah, well, insulting people is not a philosophical argument, and if that's all you have nothing. Yeah, and if you're saying, yeah, my master solved this issue in this obscure article, and you're not defining anything and you're just expounding it as an article of faith, then you're using an appeal to authority, which is usually considered a logical, like falsity was the word? Logically unsound, okay? People who use Bertrand Russell in that way, okay? We frequently see, videos and articles with titles like Wittgenstein Solved Philosophy. I saw a video recently with a title that said Wittgenstein solved philosophy twice, and actually watched bits of it, and it was super smart, very interesting. It's just a catchy name, actually. I mean, it's his video is a lot more subtle than that, so it's a good video, worth checking out. But there are people who believe that. I've read a lot of, I've come across a lot of people who say that. Well, no, Wittgenstein did not solve philosophy at all. Okay, except if you take what he says as articles of faith, and every time I read it, the few, I do check it periodically, like not the whole books, but passages, and I'm like, no, this is very weak. I'm sorry to say, it's very weak. Okay, and why? Because he's just putting forth his beliefs, and he's refusing to engage with stuff he thinks isn't worthwhile, and if you say it's worthwhile, he says it's worth nothing. You're not demonstrating anything. You're just putting forth dictates, okay, or diktats or whatever, right? Anyway, so for a while, that sort of stuff was quite frequent among self-professed Marxists. Like Marx, this brilliant, otherworldly figure, solved history. He solved economics. Okay, I've read a lot of Marxist stuff, and it's super frequent, especially like in the 50s, 60s. I am a huge fan of Marx's written work. Most of it, essentially. I don't like the militant stuff for the reasons I'm expounding on today. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of Marx's written work. I think his basic methodology, the whole, materialist history thing, I don't think it's the only answer, but I think it's a major answer to explaining history and society, like the link between technology and economics and world culture. I mean, it totally makes sense. It just works. Okay, it's a great analytical grid. Okay, you'll get a lot out of it. You might not want to use only that, but you definitely want to use it if you really want to understand, human societies and all that stuff, right? But he was also wrong plenty of time. Okay, I guess according to some people, you could argue I am perhaps a Marxist. I mean, I wouldn't call myself that because it's a polemical term, but in many ways I kind of am, I guess, in certain ways. But I don't think he's a messiah at all. Okay, I wouldn't say he solved everything. And it goes without saying that this sort of weakness is common in thinkers who believe their actual religious holy book, holy quote unquote, the religious book of choice is the absolute objective truth. This has been attempted in philosophy. At the end of the day, you can't really have both. I mean, we'll talk about it more once I've read Thomas Aquinas and all that stuff. But your holy book is not an absolute demonstrable truth unless you choose to say it is. And you can find reasonable justifications for that, but you will never find proof that your belief is true, because that's not how it works. Okay, an appeal to authority, I've mentioned this. All that is just appeal to authority. The author, like for instance Badiou, the author is saying that author X, for instance Wittgenstein or Russell or whoever, gave the definitive answer to this question, but he does not repeat the entire demonstration. The conclusion is given as a certainty, not because it was demonstrated in front of you, dear reader, but because it was the conclusion of author X, this high and mighty figure who is obviously smarter than you, so much smarter, in fact, that the guy quoting him won't even condescend to explain to you the reasoning of this messianic figure, right? So that's usually considered a logical fallacy, as I said. The interesting thing is that in Aristotelian logic, which I'm mostly basing myself here on today, actually appeal to authority is valid. It is valid in Aristotelian logic, but only in dialectic reasoning. Okay, and I will explain a bit more at the end of this video, because this is kind of like a big part of the crucial key takeaway from this video. So, but what does that mean, dialectic reasoning? Everybody uses the word differently, hence why you want to define your words. Okay? Context is not enough, people. Okay, it's just that is just not enough. Okay, it's part of it, but you need to define your words if you're doing stuff like this. And for Aristotle, dialectic is essentially a form of reason, but it's a form of reason you're using when you're discussing something that can't be established with complete certainty. Okay, so by definition, if you're using dialectic, which relies on things like appeal to authority, that means you don't have the absolute truth. And not only you don't have it, but that means you know that you can never achieve it with this method. You are aiming towards an approximation of what you think is the closest to truth, and doubly crucially, dialectic, you do it with another person. Okay, as an exchange. You're not trying to beat the person over the head. You're trying to come to truth. So one will argue for, and one will argue against, presumably. But you're both trying to engage using a series of arguments based, for instance, on appeal to authority and some other stuff I'll mention later. But you're doing that because you're working with the other person. So it's a cooperative approach, the dialectic in Aristotle's work. And I actually think this approach is more useful. I think this is much more useful. I think it actually creates fewer errors than just saying every logical fallacy is false and we must base ourselves on pure formal logic, like cut rate Mr. Spock's, right? So now I'm doing it anyway. More on this a bit later. We're getting closer to the end of this excursion. Third and last error of Mr. Badiou, and the flaw in his reasoning, poor logic. And by that I mean a core logical error, which I've basically just explained. I've basically just mentioned, but I will give a bit more explanation here. So first of all, again, based mainly on Aristotle, the Stoics had a different set of logic. I mean, there was also the Port-Royal logic. Many people had very interesting forms of logic. The basic idea here, basing myself on Aristotle, is that there are a few types of false logic. There's two main types of real logic, which is, as I mentioned, syllogistic and dialectic. Okay. Dialectic I just explained. Syllogistic we all know, but I'll explain in a second. But there are also false types, types of false logic. For this list, I put them in three categories. There's rhetoric, which we talked about already. Which is not even part of logic. It can just play at it. It can just pretend it is, which Mr. Badiou did. Okay. Rhetoric is meant to convince by emotion and artistry. Okay. Which again is legitimate. It is better to have it than not to have it, if only not to bore your listener. It can support logic, which is to say reason, but in itself, rhetoric is not rational. Okay, it is a tool that reason can use, but it is not reason itself. Okay, reason is that which uses the tool and perhaps also what you do with that tool. Okay, but it's not the tool itself. The tool is using emotion and techniques, hand waving and rhyming, all that stuff. All the mechanics of making yourself sound funny or whatever, like all those tricks that appeals to the heart and to the emotions and excites your listener. But yeah, all these things which are important because we're human beings, we're complete human beings, but none of that is rational. It's everything but the rational. Okay, so rhetoric, it can appear to us as logical because we're projecting the narrator onto the person speaking, the aura of a smart person, but he's just in our minds playing the character of a smart person, right? So it's like Marx and his grocery list. Okay. Second type, this one is much more devious, but we've talked about it already. So sophistry and heuristics. So again, these are devious forms of manipulations that especially trained people use to make you believe X, like believe X when they're saying Y, right? Okay, so there's a whole slew of them. He mentions, in fact, that he only mentions a few because they're limitless, because the ways of being dishonest are limitless. But we've talked about them in Badiou's work at length earlier, so I'll just refer you to that. So that's a form of false logic. So it feels like logic, it tastes like logic, but yeah, it's the Diet Pepsi. It's the aspartame of logic. And finally, paralogism, which is a false argument or conclusion involving some sort of good faith error on the part of the speaker. This doesn't apply to our discussion today. First, because often, the example he does give, I think, Aristotle, is like in geometry. Like you know the laws of geometry, and you're using your geometry tool, but you make an error in manipulation, or you jot down the wrong number because you're distracted, and so you make an error for that sort of reason. So that would be a paralogism, for instance. Other forms of, you make a mistake in the different types of syllogism, so it gets pretty complicated, like in the analytics. So it's very easy to make a mistake. So yeah, that sort of thing. And on this, I cannot comment in Badiou's work, as I would need to read more. And I am not qualified at this stage to criticize or to critique his work in that regard. I did note down, however, see below. I don't even remember what I mean by that. We'll see. But yeah, why poor logic then? Why do I still say it's poor logic? Because Badiou's premises are systematically unexamined and taken for granted. This is the core problem humanity has right now. Look no further, my friends, okay? Well, that and we don't share. That and we let people starve. That's... Okay, start by feeding people and then look at your assumptions. But one of the reasons we let people starve is in part because of the justifications we don't examine that allow us to believe that it doesn't matter, stuff like that. Anyway, why is this logical? What am I talking about? Well, yeah, Badiou's premises are systematically unexamined. He keeps protesting otherwise. He gives this sort of, I guess, justifications. I think, yeah, it does seem to be like he's trying, if you like, to say that he's objective and basing himself on reason, but as we've seen, I don't think so. It is precisely those protestations which weaken his case. Okay, so here's what I mean by all this. Okay. Aristotle's logic is either syllogistic or dialectic. To establish truth via syllogism, okay, you need two things. Okay. So I will continue in a moment, but earlier I mentioned that Badiou's work was mostly relying on appeal to authority, and so it was presenting as certainty something which can never be certain. Okay, so this is the core logical error, because he's presenting as 100% certainty, syllogistic truth, something which is uncertain because its premise is uncertain, and hence it's dialectical, can never attain the truth, and he just pretends otherwise, and he pretends otherwise by trying to make people shut up and insulting them. I'm sure he doesn't do only that, but this is the problem we're addressing today. And again, I don't have anything against him personally. I'm sure that the Being and Event book has a lot of value in it. I mean, I'm sure something interesting stuff in there, I'm guessing. I'm sure he didn't devote his entire life to let's say, Maoism or whatever. I think I do not share his worldview at all. I would certainly argue that he is wrong in his assumptions, but I do not think he is in bad faith in his desire to help people. I am certain that he has devoted his life to making the world a better place. I just think his methods were not conducive to that project. Anyway, yeah, so if you have syllogistic reasoning, you need two things. You need a premise that is 100% certain. Okay? And these are very few and far between. Okay, so an example Aristotle will give quite often is geometry. So, the mathematical, sum of the angles of a triangle, they're always the same, that sort of thing. Okay, so geometry, everything in the Euclid, books, that will always be true. If you follow the rule, okay, the premise, you will always get the same result. No matter the temperature, no matter the planet, it will always work. Okay? So you need that level of premise, 100% certainty, to have a completely valid syllogism, and you need at least two people who really understand how syllogism works. Okay, so you need the speaker and the listener. So, okay, Socrates, Aristotle will expound. He will explain his reasoning. So if A then B equals C, if A and B then C, and he will accumulate these, and if I, as a listener, am well versed in the analytics, which I am not, because they're massively complicated, but if I am, then I can follow along and oh yes, Aristotle, you have demonstrated this with 100% certainty, thanks to the astonishing power of syllogism. But if your interlocutor does not have that level of certainty, and you don't have an entirely certain premise, then you will use dialectic. So as I mentioned, you have two people and they will talk and they will use other types of argument. There might be, I guess, some syllogism involved, but you will mainly use arguments because you don't have certainty, like the geometric certainty. The types of truth value, if you like, that he uses, like the most reliable is everybody knows that. Common wisdom. Okay. If you can't rely on absolute geometric truth, and you just have to, rely on, okay, I'm not sure if my premise, how certain my premise is. Well, does everybody believe it? Okay, so that's a good argument. And if you don't have that, well, do most people believe it? Okay. And if you don't have that, well, then does a very knowledgeable person, like a wise person, does he believe it? And if you don't have that, well, does, a famous person, like does Brad Pitt believe it? And if you don't have that, you don't have much. And essentially, that's kind of the basic deal. Okay. So when you're dealing with uncertain premises or people who are not knowledgeable enough about syllogism, which is most of us, this is a guide to reasonable everyday conversation, and reasonable in particular in the sense that it tries to use reason to aim at truth. So it may get somewhat convincingly close, but it can never attain certainty, as I have repeated quite often, because a conclusion cannot be more certain than its premise. Okay, this matters a lot. This is decisive here. Okay, and one only uses appeals to authority and received wisdom when one has uncertain premises. Okay, you can never achieve any degree of certainty with that. It's not possible. So yeah, note that the appeal to logical fallacies to disprove an opponent's point of view, an opponent's point, so which is something we hear quite often these days. I could say it's a topoi actually. Huh? So somebody will say something online and somebody like on Reddit will answer, oh, that's a logical fallacy, so-and-so, strum an argument, or, you know, appeal to authority. But doing that in itself is an appeal to authority. I will explain that a bit later on in other videos, but if you think about it, again, that person is not demonstrating anything. He's just quoting ape law. He's just quoting the Wikipedia article. And who says that something is demonstrably untrue because the authority says it's true? Okay? You know, if I'm looking, I cook a lot, I like cooking. It's a hobby, I love cooking. Okay? It's fun. Well, if I'm looking for a recipe for some cake or hollandaise sauce, you know who I look for? An authority. Okay? I am, you know, and if I'm arguing with a friend about the hollandaise sauce, okay, which I've barely succeeded in vaguely doing once and I botched it, if you have me and Paul Bocuse or Gordon Ramsay or who knows, and your friend is trying to establish the best way of making a hollandaise sauce, you know what's a good way of figuring out the truth? Appeal to authority. Gordon Ramsay, he makes a better sauce than me because he's a world famous chef. Okay, so it's valid. It's completely valid. It just doesn't establish a certainty. Okay. But it's still valid. So if somebody says it's invariably false, it proves that you're wrong, okay, that you're using logical fallacy. You're just quoting the received wisdom. Received wisdom is what you use in dialectics when you don't have certainty. Okay. Otherwise, give me the full demonstration of your argument. Okay. Don't use topoi, like just general cliches, essentially. Anyway, almost finished here. If you have absolutely certain premises, then you use syllogism. If A and B, then C. If you have to appeal to authority or receive wisdom to make your point, by definition, your premise isn't certain. You may be certain of what you're saying. More power to you. But you may be certain, but your premise isn't certain. Okay, and it's important to distinguish the two. Okay, this is what's called a homonym. Okay, which is again why you want to define your words. Okay, not the same thing. So quoting other philosophers, okay, as authorities to strengthen our position is valid and legitimate, but it never can and never will establish certainty. Only a direct demonstration can do that, based on indisputable premises, and these are few and far between. Again, geometry. Quoting a philosopher shouldn't be used to obfuscate that fact. So it's fine to quote a philosopher, but you're not establishing an absolute law, okay? Which is, again, what Badiou is doing. He's saying, this is solved, this is done, we know this, because his prophet said so, I guess. And we know this is true because he will get mad at you if you disagree and call you names. Those are not philosophical arguments. So yeah, quoting a philosopher shouldn't be used to obfuscate the fact that it's an appeal to authority because you're trying to strengthen your case in an uncertain environment. Okay, you're trying to make the best case you can, starting from an uncertain premise, and that's fine. It's perfectly fine to appeal to authority. We do it all the time, you know. But you have to be willing to get called out on it. It's part of the gig, okay. And if you accept that, it's perfectly groovy. Okay, it's fine. Finally, other issues. So just quickly, because I noted a few other stuff. Overuse of unexplained jargon. So I'm not. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt here to Mr. Badiou, because I only read it once. I could kind of follow along with what he was saying, but it's obvious I was not understanding a lot of it. You kind of get the feel eventually for the different types of confusion you get when you read a work. Like actually, as I said, I started reading massively philosophy last year, but I did a master's on literature like 30 years ago, and I was reading a lot of Derrida back then. Actually, kind of met him once. Topic for another day. Derrida inspired a lot of people who kind of try to copy him and his way of writing, same as people do with Zizek today. And if you read it in French, Derrida, he's often criticized by people around, like certain people in the English world and maybe in French also. But he can get criticized sometimes for using obscure, phrases and jargon. Same as Heidegger, but for different reasons. But you can kind of compare the type of criticism. And actually, if you can read Derrida in French, he's quite literate. He really writes brilliantly and beautifully, and there is a reason he writes that way, and he is completely trying to make a valid point, okay? And he's just hard to translate, so that doesn't help. But there's a lot of people who try to copy Derrida, and they were just mimicking the strange style, and it was just a goo of protoplasmic quasi-meaning. Okay, I was reminded of that when reading Badiou, but I don't think it was necessarily that. It might be because I didn't read his other books. I got the same sort of impression again with Zizek. I will say though that people do criticize Heidegger for his jargon. I think if you've read certainly Aristotle, he becomes a lot easier to understand, and you do find usually at least a few articles and texts I've read by Heidegger, you actually can follow along pretty easily because he is trying to explain to you what he's doing. He was a teacher. He was a very good and loved teacher for a long time. And you can definitely see the teacher in the way he talks. It's just that he's using language in a way we're not used to. It's not a default setting. Okay, he's pointing to things rather than describing things. But again, we'll talk about it another time. But still, people criticize Heidegger for using jargon, like Adorno famously, and people accuse Derrida of also trying to confuse people. And again, some stuff that the analytic people, philosophers, so-called. I'm sorry, but I was not impressed. Okay, I have not been impressed yet, but still, okay. They will claim that it's not even worth reading Kant or Hegel or Derrida or Heidegger because they use jargon. Well, you can make sense of Kant. Even me, with my limited knowledge, I can make at least limited sense of Kant. I can see, okay, he's doing this and this and this. Same with the preface of Being and Time, which I have read. Okay. Same with Question of Technology. Same with Derrida. Okay. It's tough going, but it's doable, and it's a lot less tough now than I've read that stuff. But yeah, that Badiou text, that he doesn't get criticized for that, okay, and he does rely a lot apparently on the analytical philosopher. He like Russell and set theory and those things. And strange that he's not criticized for jargon because he uses tons of it, like words that don't seem to have any meaning and sentences that feel like they are not written as texts that are meant to be deliberately easy to understand, you see? The words are not chosen in a way to articulate immediately understandable concepts. There's a lot of vague stuff in there, I felt. But again, I have not read his other books, so this might be ignorance on my part. I am totally willing to entertain that possibility. That said, it is jargon heavy. He uses mathematics a lot, and his whole, oh yeah, ontology is mathematics, and once you understand that, you can never unsee it. So something to that effect. I was less than convinced by that presentation. I have more to say on that, because if you only take the point of view of reason as a faculty, like the mental faculty, yeah, the mental cannot directly interact with perception. So if you turn the mental on itself, then it will conclude that nothing exists, because it can only see itself and what it gets from the senses. But there's always an intercessor, there's always an intermediate as far as the mental is concerned, like reason. So yeah, if you only ascribe value to what the reasoning faculty produces, and you only focus on that, and you think everybody else is just mystic and stupid, well, yes, if that is your premise, then the rest follows logically. So it is logical in that regard, but that is an unexamined premise. Okay, that is a dogma. Anyway, and using mathematics, he says that Heidegger uses poetry, so why shouldn't I use mathematics? And he makes a good point here. I mean, it's a valid point. And mathematics, Aristotle has mathematics, Descartes, Leibniz, I think, has mathematics. I mean, using mathematics in philosophy has a long and distinguished tradition. But it also means that people who don't have mathematical training will not understand what you're saying, and their eyes will just glaze over, and they will just skip that part, which is what I did. And it also means that they will have to rely on you as authority. So appeal to authority, your own in this case. Okay, because you must be so smart because you know the mathematics, and obviously you are, and I'm not because I don't. Well, it's totally justifiable. I mean, it's totally valid to use mathematics in something like that. Again, but this is more or less what the famous Sokal affair was about. Okay, people using mathematics. In his case, he argued that the people were using unsound and just spurious mathematical statements. But here's the point: I can't determine if Badiou's mathematics are sound or not. I just have to take his word on it, and I think that's it does not invalidate the work at all. And maybe his math is impeccable, but I have to take his word on it, and that's a weakness. It's not a moral weakness, but it doesn't strengthen his case. Okay, and I mentioned I read it in French. Yeah, lots of vague, esoteric words left unexplained. I mentioned that it's kind of like what people criticize Heidegger and Derrida for wrongly, in my opinion. I've mentioned that. Yeah, if you're not defining your terms, if, as Badiou says, you use words like metaphysics and Heideggerian to insult people, which Badiou did. He apparently, check out the Deleuze Philosophy video, he was, using Heideggerian as an insult. Being called Heideggerian is kind of like being called a racist, or a Marxist if you're on the right. It's just a word you say, and that immediately means the opposite person is wrong. Yeah, well, why does that work? Because it's being used ideologically, which is to say emotionally, right? Same thing, okay? And how do we know? Because it's not defined. It's just a word used for its shock value and its condemnation value. You're just putting a stamp on somebody, like the scarlet letter. Like, you're impure, shut up, okay? So how is this different from just hurling words around in a bar fight? Okay. This severely, again, undermines the value of your work. And if you use sophistry to define your terms, you're really in trouble. I'm not sure if he does that, but yeah. Undefined terminology is one of the most frequent indicators of ideological discourse. You're just a racist. You're just a Marxist. You're just a Heideggerian. I mean, I haven't seen really if Badiou uses sophistry to define his terms, but he doesn't even define his terms, like generally speaking. He just, again, presumes that his one interpretation is the one true way, and he just accumulates the words as dogmas, essentially. If you're using unexamined words and unexamined concepts and, unexamined premises, I mean, I'm sorry, but it's not much of a philosophical work, as far as I'm concerned. Though much of it may be of interest, and sometimes maybe it's not necessary. Like Nietzsche doesn't do most of the stuff I just mentioned. Like he's more like a prophetic kind of guy, and he does insult people. So there's a tradition for that. But the fact is that in our time period, in our days, one of the key problems, perhaps the key problem, as I mentioned, is that so much of our entire collective and intellectual and personal, even like discourse, is all based on unexamined premises. We just believe stuff and we never stop to wonder, does that make sense? Like, what do the words I use to define my worldview, what do they actually mean? Is there like an underlying narrative, perhaps? Like, is everything really about skin color and race? Like, is that really the only interpretation of the world that exists? Or economics? Like, what do you mean economics? Like, is economy synonymous with the stock market? Because that's the way we think of it. Or is it we have needs, we need to fulfill them? Why is feeding people not considered part of economics? Since it's actually the basis of economics. Okay, you see? That sort of thing. So yeah, the main problem we have is not bias. In fact, what we call bias, what is bias pointing to, is an unexamined premise. And your premise may be mostly true, but the fact that it is unexamined is what gets you and the world in trouble, and me and all of us. And that's what Badiou does. He starts from his chosen premise, and he takes it from there, and he builds a structure, kind of like Zizek does, at least in this book, with his whole Hegelian, Lacanian thing. And it's a beautiful edifice, and it's very interesting, and smart things are said, and it makes you smarter, maybe, if you read it. It can. But it's still an edifice built on unsound, unexamined, grounds and premises. This must be true because I choose to believe it, right? But that's not how philosophy works. Not for me, anyway. So this was my interminable response to our the excellent Deleuze Philosophy video, who I thank profusely for the excellent video he made. I found it very interesting. I have a Patreon if you want to encourage, like, to support my work. I also have a Substack, so if you do, it matters a lot and it counts a lot, and you have my heartfelt thanks. And if you've made it through this far, I heartily salute you, and again, my heartfelt thanks. And that's it for today. Thanks to you, thanks to everyone, thanks to Deleuze Philosophy, thanks to Mr. Badiou for devoting his life to the betterment of mankind, which I do believe he has tried to do. He has tried to be helpful to the liberation of humanity, and who can be against that? So yeah, anyway, see you soon. Live long and prosper, take care, and until next time, this is Christian Maltais signing off, reminding you to read the damned work.